coming up now in 5, 4. Hey everybody, welcome to the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It is a joy to be with you. Well, we're a few days into the peace deal, or is it a ceasefire? And what about President Trump's speech at the Knesset? It seems that he said the quiet part out loud about a good many things. I think we make a huge mistake when we write him off. It's always not the smartest thing to think that you are the smartest person in the room. People don't tell you everything, and you only know about them what they tell you. Everything else is conjecture. But there are so many moving parts in this peace deal. There are so many people who went to Israel because this is so consequential. Remember, real estate deals have already been cut because Ivanka Trump, Kushner, and Jared Kushner, who actually brokered the deal. Remember, Netanyahu used to stay in his room. They're very, very close family friends. And they were shocked. You could see that they were taken aback that President Trump was cheered by hundreds of thousands of people. But when Prime Minister Netanyahu in his own country was mentioned, it was a chorus of boos. But let's not misinterpret that to think that Israelis are against, according to the polls, what's happening in Gaza. They think Gazans should be removed. So we need to talk about that. And who is Miriam Adelson? Oh, who is Sheldon Adelson? Who are these people? Why did they all feel that they needed to go for this peace deal? Or was it a ceasefire? Tune in on Instagram, Santita Jackson IG, the Santita Jackson and Friends Facebook page, Blue Sky Santita Jackson .bsky.social. Of course, I'm right here on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. Everybody like and share. Hey, Solomon, RJW949. I don't know. I used to get names, but now I'm getting handles. But you know I love you, Izzy. Sending you all so much love. Let's talk about this. And whenever I talk about these issues, there's such tremendous consequence. I reach out to the Quincy Institute because I read Responsible Statecraft every day. I'm always combing it, because I really think that they take the 30,000-foot view, but they also go down into the weeds. Certainly, I read outlets that lean left and right, but I really appreciate the fact that they go down the middle. And I really, really appreciate Eli Clifton's work. I've admired you for a long time. I'm so glad that you're with me today. Of course, he's a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute, and he's an investigative journalist at Responsible Statecraft. Indeed, that is what you do. You all are responsible, and you help us to understand statecraft because there's a lot more to this than many of us know. Welcome to the show, Eli Clifton.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I'm so honored to have you here. Let me just start here. What happened in this Gaza-Israeli peace deal? It's being called a peace deal. We haven't talked about the West Bank, which is where the settlements are ongoing, but we can get to that in a hot second. What was actually brokered between Hamas and Israel?
Well, I think that is the really important question. And I like that you're making this distinction between is it a ceasefire or a peace deal? Because a ceasefire is something that we've had before, and it's something that can be enacted pretty quickly. Now, a peace deal implies something more comprehensive, something that's lasting, something that will fundamentally resolve at least some aspect of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or at least the fate of Gaza. Now, I think it's really important to look at the three different phases that this agreement has, because some of them are a lot easier to achieve than others. Now, phase one, which is what we're in right now, involves the hostage release of the remaining Israeli hostages and remains of Israeli hostages who were in Gaza, a prisoner exchange of Palestinian prisoners and detainees, of which I think nearly 2,000 who have been or to be released. and a surge of humanitarian aid being allowed into Gaza. Now, already there's been some hiccups along the way. The Israelis have said that actually Hamas has not delivered all of the remains. They claim now that one of the bodies is actually a Palestinian. So there's some disagreements already, and some of that have already led to not as much aid getting in as was strongly suggested would occur. And then the final piece of this, which we are not at yet, is an Israeli withdrawal to an agreed upon so-called yellow line that is within Gaza. Now, all of that, I think that's probably achievable. These are all pretty straightforward steps that don't require too much external coordination beyond from Hamas and Israel. Now, phase two is already something that a lot of people looking at this say they don't understand how we get there, which is the main part of this is the disarmament of Hamas. Well, Hamas are now back out on the streets in Gaza, running security, acting as police, some of them in uniform, identifying as Hamas, which we had not seen much over the past 2 years. So this is a fundamentally different step, and it's really unclear how or if it would be achieved, or whether Hamas would go along with this, with completely disarming. Who's going to monitor this? Who's going to assess whether they have done so or not? Already Donald Trump has sort of suggested, well, he understands that in the near term, yeah, actually Hamas is gonna need to rearm and return to the streets of Gaza because somebody needs to run it. So he sort of is trying to have it both ways, saying, yeah, it's actually important that they come back right now and start, bringing about, law and order in Gaza. But in the long term, we at least have it written down on paper that they need to essentially disappear. And once they have disarmed, this is supposed to go hand in hand, again, with a very difficult step about the future governance of Gaza, which is involving a temporary transitional governing committee, basically of Palestinian technocrats who have had no association with Hamas or probably with Fatah either, alongside international experts. This would be supervised by a board of peace chaired by Donald Trump. There was some discussion that perhaps Tony Blair would be brought in to essentially temporarily, be the governor of Gaza at some level. Now it seems like Donald Trump is walking that back. And with this will all come in hand. This is a big phase two, I might add. Step two is economic development of Gaza, a convening of experts to turn it into a special economic zone.
But haven't they done that?
Now all of that is pretty difficult.
Yeah.
And we're not even at phase three.
Well, I mean, help me to understand the economics of it, because I think we haven't delved deeply enough into that. Because it seems that the deals have already been cut on Gaza. And so I'm trying to figure out if the Palestinians, who, by the way, are among the most educated group of Arabs in the diaspora. I mean, let's be very, very clear. And it seems that the people who they would want in Gaza, those folks who have cut the deal, and it's Israelis, it's Jared Kushner, it's Saudi Arabia, it's a mixed bag here. They really do have plans, and they're not talking about that anymore, to turn this into the Mediterranean, a resort area. And yet you have these people returning home. I would suspect that they would want to rebuild their hospitals, their schools, their universities. I mean, because it's not just some strip. This was a very, very developed area, Eli Clifton. Could you elaborate on that?
I think it's really important to bring the same scrutiny that we're bringing to this so-called peace deal and these different elements that seem incredibly difficult to achieve. I think we should bring that same scrutiny to these AI-generated vaporware notions of Gaza on the Riviera. And I would just point to another one of these great projects that was supposed to be showing what the region, alongside all of the capital they have, can achieve, which is Neom, the city in Saudi Arabia, which is now construction is frozen on it. I think that in Gaza is a completely different place than that. This is a place that is, infrastructure has been effectively destroyed. They don't have a power grid. They don't have a sewage. The vast majority of homes have been destroyed. The roads are bombed out. The idea that this is going to become, the Monaco or the Dubai or the Singapore somehow of the region, to me, that sounds like a fairy tale. And I admit that there's plenty of opportunity in such a plan for there to be corruption, for there to be the displacement of Palestinians. And that's something we should certainly ask if they try to pursue this plan. But I see this as being much like a lot of the details in this so-called peace plan, stuff that's sort of being thrown at the wall, saying, we have a plan, it's going to be great, don't worry about it. But in the meantime, before any of those things can happen, there's some more immediate challenges, challenges which I'm not sure if this peace deal will be able to address, or if the Trump administration is going to have the mettle to hold Netanyahu's feet to the fire in, demanding an actual Israeli withdrawal. And how are you going to also form sort of this peacekeeping force that's supposed to come in, largely comprised of soldiers from the region? These are really complicated issues, and that's all comes well before a notion of who benefits from this, conjecture of a redevelopment of Gaza. They don't have running water. Who's going to profit from a 5-star hotel built on the beach? I think that's a long way off, and I think that I personally wouldn't be putting my focus on that.
Well, where would you put your focus?
I would put my focus on what's going to happen next. How does this happen from a day-to-day? And what dangers are there of backsliding back into situations of either full-blown conflict, with Israel essentially controlling the skies over Gaza and bombing at will, largely indiscriminately targeting civilian infrastructure, or a more slow motion version of it, where the aid doesn't quite come in at the levels that are required for rebuilding, so they can sustain themselves, perhaps. And the Israelis calculate the amount of calories that come into the strip. So maybe there's enough for survival, but are they going to restrict building supplies coming in? In the past, they certainly have restricted that, claiming that it was going to be used for tunnels or for other infrastructure for Hamas. Are they going to allow that in until there's been this verified disarmament of Hamas? It's a little unclear. And I think that there's a lot of danger in those details of either the process stalling in a situation which is unsustainable for Palestinians to be able to live their lives and go to school and go to work and have a functioning economy, or the worst case is going back to where we were just a week ago.
But isn't the danger in the details? I mean, you just said something to me that is very profound. It's the details that could restart the genocide. I mean, not giving Hamas enough time to hand over the deceased hostages, for example, and the killings by the IDF of returning Gazans, that has already resumed. They have said that these unarmed people who are traveling back home, traveling back to the land, they've crossed these lines. I mean, because basically they're entering occupied territory. How is this supposed? I mean, what is next, and how does this work? Because all of these lines, and they're coming back under occupation. How do they proceed? I mean, because much has been made of the peace deal, and I don't think that there's not been due diligence practiced by corporate media in really distinguishing between a peace deal and a ceasefire, Eli Clifton.
I think you're absolutely right. And you said something a lot there that's really important to take note of, which is that they are returning to a place under occupation. And that is something that the peace deal, it implies sort of by the end of phase 3, some notion of self-governance, perhaps. That seems to be largely missing, or at least kicked down the road to very late stages in this supposed peace deal. So that means that up until that point, you are still functioning with a population and a territory under occupation, under a military occupation that don't control their own borders, that don't control the skies over them, that don't even control the ocean that they're bordered by on one side. And the question is, when do those pressures, when does that prison get opened? Because that's what Gaza is. And there's a myth that the Israelis had withdrawn previously and that it was no longer under occupation, in the sense that their military was not actively inside Gaza occupying all the time. But when you have a population who does not control their borders, does not control the ocean that is near them, they're not even able to go out fishing. I think that you got to start asking these profound questions that you just asked about what does it mean for a population coming back to an occupation? And what does it mean that this peace deal still kind of avoids the bigger questions about the Israeli occupation, not just of Gaza, but of the West Bank?
Well, is it a ceasefire or is it a peace deal? Because I don't know how you can have a peace deal when Palestinians don't have sovereignty.
Absolutely. And as well as, how do you have a peace deal when the most challenging pieces of achieving a peace deal that people on both sides probably could agree would be an end point of this conflict are really not dictated in this? They're really not laid out. They're not specified. They're sort of glossed over as these minor details that can be figured out and will just sort of fall into place later on. And I think that's pretty dangerous, given the complexity of this situation, and again, the centrality of the occupation in the conflict itself.
It is they are still in occupied territory, and one has to wonder: is anyone going to address the killings of Gazans that's still continuing, that's ongoing? What about the West Bank? Because the settlements, can you describe what's happening there
the problem is that the territories that would very likely be part of a future Palestinian state are being sort of, sometimes the term is used, it's like a honeycomb of the settlements, Israeli settlements that are expanding, and new ones are being formed in these territories. And they have their own settler roads that are protected by the IDF. That Palestinians cannot access. So there's a whole secondary set of infrastructure in the West Bank for Israeli settlers. And as these settlements continue and as they expand, it raises the question in a lot of people's minds about, are the Israelis sincere about trying to achieve a two-state solution? Or are they doing what many of them say they are doing, which is expanding Greater Israel, and that this is part of Greater Israel in their minds? This is Judea and Samaria, as the Likud Charter references, from the river to the sea. And this is something that is their end goal. They're doing exactly what they said, and that a two-state solution simply doesn't fit in that. And I think that what we've seen since the death of the Oslo Accords is very much a narrative of the Israelis moving towards a one-state reality, and American politicians largely staying in denial about it, using sort of this zombie peace process that's not making any progress and is being undermined day after day after day as sort of a crutch, so they don't need to address the reality of what we are supporting through our tax dollars and our political support for Israel in international forums.
Where has this placed America in the international body? I mean, I'm wondering if Israel is becoming a pariah state, as South Africa had become by the 80s. I mean, people have been talking about apartheid in South Africa in the 60s and the 70s. I remember, I'm a huge tennis fan. I remember when Arthur Ashe refused to go and he would appeal to tennis players not to go. I became an even bigger John McEnroe fan because he followed he followed the request of Arthur Ashe not to go there. And he was the number one tennis player in the world at the time. He and Bjorn Borg were battling it out. Bjorn Borg was going to have he called for a match, but it turns out it was Bjorn Borg's management team, because he now says, wait a minute, I didn't like apartheid, but that was the fight then, right?
Mm-hmm.
And eventually they became a pariah state like the American South. could not continue with Jim Crow, and then have the Atlanta Braves and the football teams going. I mean, it was locking up their economy.
Mhm.
And it appears that more and more people around the world, more and more countries, are finding it increasingly difficult to do business with Israel, to stand with them, um, because of their treatment of the Palestinians. And let me start with Israel. How are they viewed in as you've investigated, as you listen to people talk, how are they viewed around the world? And then what about the United States? And let me thank Robert and Steve. Steve, you're so sweet. Thank you. You make them feel so good. Please, everybody, like and share. Ali Shabazz, Andre, Izzy, and all the other handles, RJW949, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Solomon, sending you all so much love today. How is Israel perceived, Eli Clifton? Do you think that's an important question to ask, or should we just dismiss it?
I think it's an important question to ask. I mean, I will put on sort of my realist hat, as you know, in terms of hey, countries can act rationally. The United States needs to act rationally here. Israel is increasingly isolated, and the United States is increasingly isolated in its protection of Israel. Again, especially its protection of Israel in international forums such as at the UN. But there's places where the United States can't do so much to protect Israel, and that's, for instance, there's efforts to reject or prohibit Israeli participation in European football contests, in Eurovision. There's increasing pressure on dock workers are bringing pressure in Greece about the loading of ships for Israel. There is a real grassroots, labor-led in many cases, effort to pressure Israel, to isolate Israel, and I don't think that they're going to be able to walk back the so-called boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that is certainly growing and has only grown even greater in strength over the course of the war in Gaza. But I think that's another really interesting thing to look at when we talk about who's getting isolated here, is that American politicians are also getting pretty isolated from their own bases. The public support for this conflict was actually support for the war in Gaza, for Israel's actions. I was looking at polling. It only was actually the majority of Americans supported it like in November 2023. It has since then been unpopular, and it has been getting less popular. And when you start to look at American support for Israel, that is also something that has been declining in support. And when I say it's declining in support, it is declining across pretty much every single political group, identity group, you name it. It's declining. Now, some groups are just generally more supportive. Typically, Christian evangelicals have been more supportive of Israel than others. That probably still holds, is what I'm seeing. But they are losing support with every single group as this war has gone on, and as the atrocities in Gaza have been, live streamed largely on the internet into people's phones. It is something that is putting politicians on the opposite side of their bases. You're seeing a crack up occurring within the MAGA base, or at least with Donald Trump's base. I don't know what MAGA really is. It's everybody has their own definition, so I try not to use the term. But within the Republican Party, you have Tucker Carlson, you have Marjorie Taylor Greene, you have Steve Bannon out there saying that we shouldn't be supporting this, that this is something that is, we're killing kids in Gaza. Why are we doing this? And you see on the left, and I think the left has been a little slower on this, but look at one of the top reasons that voters who had voted for Joe Biden in 2020 did not vote for Kamala Harris in 2024, and the administration that she was a part of, and their unwillingness to use weapon sales to Israel as a point of leverage to make Israel stop the killing was one of the top reasons. They paid a political price. And I think in both parties you're seeing this happening, and you're seeing politicians wrestling with how do you justify maintaining a status quo that's become untenable for most voters.
And I think you're going to see it in the white Christian church, which is where you see Christian Zionism moving into Black churches, but there's even a pushback there. Just globally. You were about to say?
Yeah, and it's really interesting watching some of the statements being made by, I'm sure it's other right wing commentators, but Tucker
Mhm.
Carlson is the one that I've looked at the closest, where
Mhm.
he tries to speak directly to Christian Zionists. And he says, hey, one notion of, I assume that one thing we share a belief in is that, we should be protecting Christians in the Middle East. I thought that was something we cared about. And,
Mhm.
look at what they've done to Christian populations in Gaza and in the West Bank. And this is being done with U.S. tax dollars, with U.S. weapons,
Mhm.
and Israel that has done a lot of work to try to appeal to Christian evangelicals. I don't know if they're being so honest about our allyship with them. That it seems as if Christians are kind of being treated many same ways that Palestinians are, and some of those Palestinians are Christians, and really trying to elevate that issue in ways that I think they're feeling the pressure from it. Now, I think another interesting data point that we've seen very, very recently is typically Israel in its publicity efforts and in its so-called hasbara, its propaganda, has been able to have a great deal of influence within the United States through the fact that there are a lot of Americans who have been very sympathetic to Israel. And
Mhm.
they have funded these efforts, they have managed these efforts, they've been able to sort of do what, for a lot of foreign countries, requires the foreign country to do it. And so it stayed sort of a domestic issue in a legal sense. They haven't had to file under the Foreign Agent Registration Act, because if you're an American who wants to be supportive of Israel, you can do whatever you want. You don't need to disclose that in any way, shape, or form, because you're not taking direction from the foreign government in doing so. But in the past few months, we've seen Israel we've seen companies here that do publicity work starting to register under FARA because they are now needing to get money and direction from Israel,
Mhm.
which to me says that those previous efforts have been insufficient to maintain the support, to maintain the status quo that Israel relies on to be able to maintain the occupation, and to be able to avoid making those sort of compromises and that would be required for a meaningful peace deal.
Well, what about Netanyahu's meeting with young American influencers after he spoke
Yeah.
at the United Nations, and the purchase of one of his most prominent supporters, the Ellison family's purchase of CBS
Mhm.
and TikTok? How do you think that will pan out? Because I always read the comments after the story is written, and it's this is not. I don't think this is not a very popular thing. Uh, a lot of people are saying this is too much control, and it's not about religion. I think Americans at this time are just resistant to the oligarchy. They're becoming more and more resistant on the right and the left and center and outside. And help me, where do you see this going? Because it
Well,
seems it's a
I think the Ellison purchase of CBS and their reported leadership role in the purchase of TikTok, which I think has been pushed off by a couple
Mhm.
months, it hits at a couple things, and I think you named one already, sort of the oligarchy or the plutocracy, perhaps, and their control over our media, their control over how we access information, and their willingness to push their own political agendas, whatever that might be. But that brings us to sort of a second hot button issue, which is that Oracle talks very openly. The former CEO of Oracle, Safra Katz, Larry Ellison, its founder, are very clear that they want to promote Israel and that Israel's is actually a central issue for this publicly traded technology company. It doesn't quite add up, but it does start to hit on something that we've been all sensitized to over the past several years, which is the notion of foreign influence. And the fact that these plutocrats who already we believe sort of exist, in a transnational space and operate as, as with some of them have, incomes that exceed the GDP of some countries. So obviously they're not constrained by governments or borders. Might be at times promoting interests that are not even, of the country that they say they're from, because and they actually are saying this stuff out loud. And that's what's so fascinating about the Ellisons and Safra Katz is that, at Oracle, for instance, if you are not pro-Israel enough, or if you voice concern about the company's pro-Israel policies, you are referred for mental health counseling. Now,
unbelievable.
now that is dystopian. And when you're told that actually these people are now going to own CBS News and they would like to take over one of the largest social media companies, Yeah, that's going to make people uncomfortable, both because of the money involved, as well as that these people seem to have some very, very sort of bizarre, backward interests that most people probably can't relate to.
Well, Eli Clifton, before we just drapetomania was a term that my brother, Congressman Jonathan Jackson, brought to me years ago. And I said, well, he said, do you know what that is? I said, absolutely not. In, that was a mental disorder that Black people had if they did not want to be slaves. And so when I heard that, I said, this is what this reminds me of. And it seems like it's a bridge too far. Uh, Speaking of which, speaking of saying the quiet part out loud, I felt that the Knesset speech that the president gave was quite fascinating. He appeared to be it was almost stream of consciousness. Yes, he was, but I listen to everything he says because I think that he does mean what he says, whatever it is. And let's just give me a top down view of it. And then let's get into Miriam Adelson because I didn't know, I had a feeling she was there, but I didn't know he would say that she was there.
Absolutely. I mean, let's get into it. Miriam Adelson. I mean, what he said, and the mainstream media in this country largely didn't report the last part of what he said. But
Yes.
he said, and remember, to give some context here, Miriam Adelson is the biggest donor to Donald Trump between Donald Trump's three presidential campaigns. She is the largest, so she and her now deceased husband were the largest donors to the Republican Party since Citizens United opened the floodgates of campaign contributions. They put over $600 million into the Republican Party, and a lot of that went to efforts to get Donald Trump elected. Now, he said, I actually asked Miriam Adelson, and I'm going to get her in trouble with this, but I actually asked her once. I said, so Miriam, I know you love Israel. What do you love more, the United States or Israel? She refused to answer. That means it might mean Israel. And, that's pretty consistent with other statements she has made herself. Sorry,
Yeah,
go ahead.
and her husband too. He said, "I dream of our children fighting in the IDF."
Yeah.
Okay, so what was your takeaway from that?
My takeaway was that he's simply saying the thing that most politicians won't say out loud, which is that, yeah, policy is for sale. And actually, I found remarks he made from 2024 when he was running for president again, where he talked about how all the things he had done, and he would go back and forth between saying, I did it for Israel or I did it for the Adelsons. And these included withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, giving the Golan Heights to Israel, and finally moving the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which was supposed to be sort of a final status issue for a two-state solution, and it was considered to be putting the U.S. thumb on the scale to move it to Jerusalem and declaring that Israel's capital and treating it Israel's capital. Now, one I think useful anecdote to look at is exactly in that story with the move of the embassy, is that they had this problem when they moved the embassy, is that they didn't want to make it so easy for another president down the road to move the embassy back to Tel Aviv. And one of the elements of the real estate that they had in Tel Aviv that made it possible to have the embassy there was a beachfront compound in Herzliya, which is a suburb of Tel Aviv, a very valuable piece of property, which was being used as the ambassador's residence. Now, they could sell it, but it's possible that the buyer would sell it back to the U.S. government. So they needed to find a seller who, first of all, would have $60 million to buy it, and who would be committed to making sure that this was not used, either renting it or selling it back, to be used as the ambassador's residence should the embassy be returned to Tel Aviv. So they sold the U.S. ambassador's home from the U.S. government. They sold it to the Adelson family. And that's the level of involvement in policy, in how money shapes policy, and the ways in which Donald Trump sees all of this as a real estate transaction that I think underpin his relationship with his family and his relationship with Israel. This is a family that prioritizes Israel. They openly talk about that. They are the biggest donors in our political system. And when we should believe them when they say why they're doing what they're doing, and we should believe Donald Trump when he says what is motivating his biggest donors and what is motivating some of his policy decisions, which is to give things to his biggest donors. Those are the words he uses when he describes it.
Because he also said, and pardon me, I called them Adelsons. I hear you. Um, he also said they come to the White House more than anybody.
Yeah.
It's
I
like
mean,
they have free reign.
when you're the biggest donor, I think you get free reign.
Yeah, but I mean, should we as Americans be concerned about that?
Absolutely. And we should listen to what these people say they want. And we should listen to candidates like Donald Trump when they say what their biggest donor wants. These people, nobody's hiding this except a media that doesn't feels uncomfortable, doesn't want to openly talk about this because it suggests that our politicians are for sale, or it might get misused by anti-Semites who are saying this is somehow something you can generalize about all Jews, which is not true. It just happens to be that this family has exerted an enormous amount of influence, and they are proud of it. And Donald Trump is open about it as well.
What about, is it the Maccabee Project?
Yeah.
What
Maccabee
is
Task
that?
Force.
What is that?
So the Maccabee Task Force is an organization that was initially really focused on pushing back against efforts on college campuses to advance BDS against Israel. But in the past year or two, excuse me, it became very focused on targeting any protests against Israel's war in Gaza or against the Biden administration and then later the Trump administration's support for Israel's war in Gaza. Now, something that's kind of interesting here is that this group, which had advocated before it had happened of the revoking green cards from students who were voicing criticisms of Israel, is that there's something a little hidden about this group, which is that it says that the head of it is David Brogg, who I think was the head of Christians United for Israel, a major pro-Israel evangelical group. But that they're actually, when you dig into their tax forms, there's a president of this group. And the president of that group is Miriam Adelson. So you have the Republican Party and Donald Trump's biggest donor leading and funding a pressure group that is telling the administration to target certain individuals, including revoking green cards and trying to bring legal action against people for First Amendment protected speech. And then you see the administration, coincidentally or not, doing exactly what this group says. And I think, again, it's a tell. This is what Miriam Adelson wants. She wants to criminalize speech in this country that challenges U.S. policy toward a country 6,000 miles away. That is something she explicitly wants. She is leading an advocacy and a pressure campaign to achieve that. And they have met some degree of success in that effort. And I don't think that the First Amendment or American civil liberties are something that Miriam Adelson has much concern for when it comes to protecting Israel and protecting it from criticism within this country.
Is she, how do you think that that will play out, though? I mean, because I think it speaks to her politics, but we see big money all over American politics, just broadly speaking. I think part of the pushback on Robert Kennedy, quite frankly, is big pharma.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some of the people I admire the most in politics have really drilled down on him in these hearings. But when you see how much money they get from big pharma, you kind of have to question. You see just these different entities, the military industrial complex. I mean, and these become the sacred cows that you cannot touch in public discourse. You see, no one talks about the prison industrial complex and the profit motive in housing and detaining these migrants. Because people make a lot of money detaining migrants and they put them to work. I mean, what do we make of Miriam Adelson in particular at this time? But just even more broadly, the money in our politics and how it's shaping everything to our detriment, I might add.
Absolutely. I think at the roots of this one does have to talk about campaign finance reform as being a necessity if we want to reclaim our democracy and truly democratize policymaking and foreign policy. That is one of the root problems here. I do think that foreign policy like some other issues, some of which you've mentioned, often are hard to mobilize the public around because they are not always the most visible. It doesn't impact people in a day-to-day manner. Typically, foreign policy is one that, that the reason that you often have this bipartisan consensus around it is that it's easy to sort of maintain a status quo and not challenge norms too much because you're not pressured to do so by your constituents. And there's probably other topics like that as well. I mean, the prison industrial complex is a good example. That doesn't really, people don't see it. Most people don't.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't impact them in a way that they can see and feel in a day-to-day basis. And it makes it something easy to tolerate. Now, I think that Gaza has now sort of, crossed a Rubicon when it comes to that because of the fact that, as I was, I think, alluding to earlier,
mm-hmm.
people can see these images. And that's thanks to the internet, despite the fact that journalists aren't allowed into Gaza, the images are still getting out. People can see how horrific this is, and they are being made aware of the role that the US government is playing in enabling it. This isn't just some conflict happening on the other side of the world that, the question is, should the United States parachute in as peacekeepers or something or not? Or something that we can easily say, well, we don't think that's good. That's not what this is. And people are making the connection between the use of their tax dollars, and the political support that Israel's getting, and the constant flow of weapons, a lot of which are being manufactured in this country to be used against civilians in Gaza. And they're really angry about it. And it's becoming one of the most divisive and one of the most mobilizing at the same time foreign policy issues that I think I've seen certainly in my lifetime.
But is it divisive or is it illuminating? Because more and more people are moving into that camp. When you see Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's becoming the populist that I think that people thought that Donald Trump was going to be. I mean, she's taken these stances on healthcare, on the government shutdown, on Gaza, and she's used the language that that used to be the third rail in American politics, and she is going full throttle into this, eyes wide open. And she said, I'm here and I'm not moving. And I think that she's a savvy politician. I'm not saying that she's not a woman of principle, because she is taking a risk and she's willing to do it. But what she's doing, I think she sees something out there, Eli Clifton. She sees something and she is going forward. Just like she said, look, you've got to do something about healthcare, because my children's premiums are going to double. I've done well, but I haven't done well enough to be able to carry my children like this. This is ridiculous. So I'm seeing people like her, and she's continuing to amplify. Thomas Massey, they're pouring money in against him. He said, I don't care. There are things that you all are doing that I feel that the Republicans at stake. And I think more and more people feel that way.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you only have so much elasticity in how far both parties can get from the issues and the interests of the American public, broadly speaking. And I think we're reaching a breaking point here. I think that in the Democratic Party, we haven't maybe as clearly identified that has occurred, but the last election should be a lesson in that. There's certain things where voters will not come out. They're just going to say, you know what, you can only go so far. Genocide, you can't tell me the other guy is going to be worse. Maybe he is, but you got to do better than the other guy being worse.
Yeah.
You just got to do better than that. And you're not going to use how bad the other guy is as a cudgel to make people go vote and lower their standards. And I think that in the Republican Party right now, what you're alluding to is some variation of the same phenomenon. Where finally you're seeing, and I think Thomas Massey is an excellent example, Rand Paul also, certainly Marjorie Taylor Greene, people who are just saying, you know what, I'm just only going along with this so far. Because first of all, I have my principles, and second, I actually think I'm going to have a better chance of getting reelected if I talk about healthcare premiums, if I talk about the fact that I don't think we should be sending weapons to be used against kids in Gaza. I just, and you know what? I think they might be right. I think there's an opening here, and you're seeing members of the Republican Party who are seeing that and they're going for it. And I think it's a really fascinating moment to watch because the Republican Party, as we've been talking about with the Adelson family and other donors, I think has been the one that's been the most, perhaps a bit more captured by the Israel lobby. But I think also we're starting to see a breaking point in that. And yeah, there's plenty of Democrats who've been critical as well. But let's be honest, the loudest voices right now that are getting the national media attention, calling out this war as a genocide, are Republicans.
And why do you think that is? I mean, what happened with the Republicans? Because one finds oneself, because I'm ardently opposed to this. I will say this. I seek to be fair on this show. I do. That having been said, you know where I stand on this, and I've taken my hits in terms of placement on radio and all of that. But I believe what I believe. Why did this happen in the Republican Party? I mean, and money is the mother's milk of politics, and you have a lot of people who fund. Like you have people who you have the Adelsons on both sides, quite frankly.
Yeah,
What happened on the Republican side?
I think that those are really interesting questions, and I have two answers. One is that, and this is not such an interesting answer, it's that, public opinion against this war has only been magnifying. And in the period between the election and now, Americans have shown that they are much more offended by it than they were in the past. So it's possible, and we can't really test this, that had Kamala Harris won, that the Democratic Party would be going through a similar process right now. I don't know. We can speculate. But the other piece that I would point to is that Donald Trump and more broadly the Republican Party, I think, had identified as early as 2015 when he was running for president the first time. He identified that Americans were really tired of a foreign policy that seemed to be overly militaristic, that seemed to be focused on a lot of foreign wars, on supposedly making us safer, but in reality seeming to just cost a lot of money, kill a lot of people, and not really produce those outcomes. And he stood alone, for the most part, in the primary field at the time, actually saying those things, saying, actually, I think the Iraq war was a mistake. And he said that we needed to be a more neutral arbiter between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And he said about the Iran nuclear deal that his main problem with it was that Iran was buying more Airbus planes than Boeing. Now, a lot changed once he won the nomination. He had to raise $1 billion to run at the general election. And I think around that time, people like the Adelsons and others started to have some influence over him, or he engaged in a transaction with them of sorts. But the point is that, he said, part of the movement that he represented was rejecting the status quo on so many of these issues. And I think a lot of that did trickle down into the Republican Party. And people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, again, people like Steve Bannon, people like Thomas Massey, I think, really do believe these things, and they don't share some notion that we need to uphold, failed status quo policies. And when it comes to something like maybe healthcare or something like certainly Gaza, even if Donald Trump is willing to compromise on that, they see political upside to actually holding to this and saying, no, we're not just going to accept this for what it is. And actually, I'm going to stand on principle with it. And so I think there's something really interesting that happened in the Republican Party. I think some of that started with Donald Trump's first candidacy. Again, I don't think he's necessarily upheld it himself necessarily, but I think there's members of the Republican Party who have.
Do you see it maybe happening on the Democratic side? In Kamala Harris's book, 107 Days, she says any mention of Gaza, and the fear was by the Adelsons that she was more supportive of the Palestinians than she would say. And it appears that that was true. Any mention, can we move a little bit on this issue? She was shot down. That's what she writes in her memoir. Do you see any of that changing on the any Democratic voices?
Yeah, I mean, Rashida Tlaib is amazing. Ilhan Omar is
Mhm.
fantastic. There are voices out there. I think what is sad to see is people who were in the Biden administration, including Kamala Harris,
Mhm.
having a lot to say when they no longer have access to power. Then now they say, oh, I was against this the whole time, or I really didn't want this to happen, or I was deeply uncomfortable with it at the time. She was the Democratic nominee for, if she didn't have the ability to take a stand on it then, uh, I don't know what sort of solace we're supposed to take in her saying, "Oh, it was hard." Um, that was her shot.
Mm.
And at the Democratic National Convention, they chose not to let a Palestinian speak, and the groups that were pushing for
Wait,
that said,
a Palestinian who is in the party, someone.
and the DNC and the Harris campaign would get to vet and approve
Yes.
the remarks that were going to be given. Those were the terms that were offered. They could pick the person, and they could essentially write or dictate what the person said.
Yeah,
And
and
the
they would not.
campaign, they would not let that happen.
She couldn't veer off. They knew her because she is someone who would not veer off script. I mean that's who they had. She was going to play by their rules and they would not let that happen. And that was hurtful. It is a game of inches. It was 1.5 million votes that separated her and Donald Trump. And 90 million people, to your point earlier, did not vote. She got like 77 million votes plus. He got 78 and a half plus, but 90 million did not vote. I mean, and those 90 million are still here.
Absolutely. And you know what? The Trump campaign saw this happening in real time, and they capitalized on it. Because
Hmm.
remember, they were sending their representatives to Michigan. They were speaking
Hmm.
to Arab and Muslim communities there, expressing more sympathy, more empathy for the suffering that these communities were feeling due to their familial relations with people in Gaza than the Harris campaign did. And one can say that was politics, that was cynical. That the Trump then turned around and once he was president and essentially gave Netanyahu a wish list of weapons and policy cover and all of that. And that's all legitimate. But let's not forget that in October they were out there saying, actually, you know what, the policies that are going on are hurtful to you, and we think it's wrong. And that was more than the Democratic Party and more than Kamala Harris could be brought to do. And I think that a lot of people saw that very clearly as a very serious mistake.
Where do you see this? Because corporate media did not talk about this stream of consciousness talk on Marion Adelson that was buried inside of this Knesset speech, which I thought was so consequential. I have to tell you, my mouth dropped open. I said, he's saying the quiet part out loud and he's not stopping. He's continuing. He went on, oh, I asked you, who do you love? Ha, ha, ha. Israel or America? You didn't say America, so ha, ha, ha. I felt like he dropped a bomb
Mhm.
in America. And if you look at social media, people are amplifying it. I mean, so help me to understand that. I mean, because to for corporate media not to talk about it, it hurts them.
The funny thing is that corporate media actually did talk about this, but in a very different context
Hmm.
back in 2012. And this was before we had the Russiagate stuff and the fears about foreign influence in elections. And what we did have was the first post Citizens United and Speech Now election. And that election was the one where ultimately Mitt Romney became the Democratic nominee. But earlier on, Newt Gingrich was one of the front runners.
Yes.
And it was the first and only time that the Adelson family have picked a horse, as it were, in the primaries, and they backed Newt Gingrich. And they were putting money into Gingrich's campaign. Nobody had ever seen this type of money being dropped on a candidate via super PACs before, because this was uncharted territory. And everybody was afraid that Citizens United and the Speech Now was going to unleash corporate money into the election system. And I think the Adelsons were very sensitive to that. So was Newt Gingrich, and they wanted to address that. And they got out there, and Gingrich said it, and Sheldon Adelson said it, and Adelson Family Advisors and Sands Corporation, which is their company, were out there saying, everybody was saying it as loud as they could, which is, this is about Israel. They were adamant about it because they didn't want there to be any misunderstanding about the motivations of why this money was being put in to support Newt Gingrich. And I think since then, it's ebbed and flowed how openly it's being talked about, but it's never really been a secret. And, the levels of their influence, they don't hide it. A great anecdote I love to talk about because people forget it is there was a spy named Jonathan Pollard.
Yeah.
And he was, the level of the information that he passed to Israel, he was an American working in the intelligence community in the United States. He handed over highly sensitive information to Israel. Some of that eventually, I believe, made it over to the Soviet Union at the time. It involved information about the capabilities of American, I think, spy satellites and surveillance techniques. It was really the most sensitive stuff. And he did it, to be clear, for money. He was paid, I believe, in diamonds at the time. And he also felt very strong about being pro-Israel, or at least he did after when he needed their assistance in trying to get a pardon, which he did not get. Every time this got raised over the years, he got like a 30-year sentence or something. There would be massive pushback from Republicans and Democrats. Anybody who had had access to classified information or was in contact with the intelligence community would come out swinging, saying this guy did enormous amounts of danger, harm to the United States. He should not have a pardon. He should not get parole. So eventually he does get parole. He serves out his sentence. And as his parole ends, there is still a travel restriction on him. Effectively, they took his passport away. And there was a big campaign to give him his passport back, lift his travel restrictions so he could emigrate to Israel. Now, it was in December, at the end of Trump's first term. He had already lost the election. And it was announced that this travel restriction had been lifted by the Trump administration. It had been well known that the Adelson family had been pushing very hard for this restriction to be lifted. But it was considered so politically sensitive, they waited until after the election to do it. So it was, during COVID, there weren't regular flights, I think, between Newark and Tel Aviv. And there's images that pop up of Pollard. He's getting on a private jet. And I remember looking at that, at the images coming out. It's like, oh my God, I know that plane. I know the paint job on this, the livery on this airplane. It's a 737. And there's a fleet of these planes. They all have the same paint job. And it was a plane that belonged to the Adelsons. Oh. So you have the largest political donor in the American political system just provided. They could have chartered a plane. They could have concealed their involvement. This was to make a statement. They provided their personal plane to fly him to Israel. And they had exclusive photos and interviews being done by the newspaper they owned, Israel Hayom, on the airplane, as well as after his arrival to a hero's welcome by Netanyahu in Tel Aviv. A lot of this is in your face. A lot of this, the people that are doing it are not embarrassed. They're not trying to conceal it. We should believe them when they say what they're doing and why they're doing it.
Before we go, how do you think Israel will fare in the American body politic?
I think they're struggling. And I think one thing that we're seeing is that whereas previously they had been able to use Israel advocacy groups in the United States that were being run by Americans, led by Americans, funded by Americans, Israel is now needing to put money from the foreign ministry to target American public opinion. They're targeting, churches in the Southwest with ad campaigns. They're paying online influencers $7,000 per post for pro-Israel content. This is very literally now, and previously being able to fudge the issue. Is this a foreign influence effort? Is this, truly, Israel as a foreign nation trying to influence Americans and how we think? It is now that. They are now directly funding campaigns to influence American public opinion. And I'm not saying that that's, enormously worse than what was going on before, because they're pushing for the same things. But the point is that the methods that have been used before have been insufficient to maintain the support that Israel needs from the United States to be able to maintain the occupation, to be able to sustain their siege of Gaza, and that this is something that now requires explicit outside interference to achieve.
Well, Eli Clifton of the Quincy Institute, of course, investigative reporter on responsible statecraft. Before you go, what was left unsaid today? What should we be looking for? What is next? Because there's got to be something.
I think that you already hit the nail on the head, which is when Donald Trump speaks, and I would add when the Adelsons speak, believe them. They very often are telling us the truth. Perhaps, especially Donald Trump, may be different than most politicians. The joke of politicians is they're always lying. Donald Trump, more often than not, is telling us what he thinks and what he's going to try to do. For better or worse, you can agree with it or disagree with it, love it or hate it. As we just talked about with that speech at the Knesset, he's simply saying the quiet parts out loud. He's not trying to hide it.
He's kind of taking us behind the curtain.
Perhaps.
Eli Clifton. Wow. Thank you so much. And keep doing the great work that you do. Responsible statecraft, everybody. This is one of the outlets. I always tell you the things that I'm reading. I go to them every day. Every day. I want to see if anyone has posted anything, because I like people who just give me the information and help me to think. Give me the information. I'll figure it out. But if you really want people who walk straight up the middle and give you keen analysis and just tell you what happened, and then you make up your own mind. It's responsible, everybody. But they're also showing you statecraft. You need to understand this. It's much more to this than you think. I'm Santita Jackson, Eli Clifton. I'll see you on the Santita Jackson Show, AM 950.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, bless.